So welcome everybody to this month's .NET Liverpool. We're going to welcome Kevin. So thank you for attending, Kevin, and he's going to be talking about .NET configuration. But before he does, and before I hand him over to you, I just want to point you all to our .NET group and welcome you all as well for attending our virtual meetup this month. We've got previous meetups. We've been going for about over 2 years now. So you can find a collection of our meetups on our YouTube channel, and including this session as well. And for any future events that you want to register to, you can follow our Twitter page and our meetup page as well. I want to thank you to our sponsors, TLA and JetBrains, for helping us with catering of all the costs of the meetup and all the free giveaways that our group can offer. So JetBrains is also giving us some JetBrains licenses every month to give away. And it's great tools. It can give you a wide range of products, some great new products that I've hit for JetBrains. The main ones I like are like ReSharper. So you can get like a lot of plugins for that if you're working with Visual Studio. And so if you'd like to enter for one of our raffles for JetBrains, just give me a PM, drop me your email address, and we'll add it to the raffle at the end. I'm going to hand over to Kevin, but basically I'd like to promote another meetup group as well, which is Mini Hack, and they're a little bit more hands-on. So Kevin, do you want to give a little introduction to Mini Hack?
Yeah, sure. So Mini Hack is kind of an event what me and Paul kind of started up. I think probably 6 months ago now. And to be fair, it's been growing since then. So we only had about 3 teams to start off with, but had about 6 or 7 teams in one of them, and it's kind of fluctuating around that. And the idea is kind of we group people together in like teams of like kind of mostly 3 or 4, to be fair. We found the kind of sweet point of that. And we give people a task, and it's usually an open-ended task to kind of complete. And anybody can use any technology, any language to complete it. So we usually have like guest judges as well, who kind of judge the competition. So far we've had Martin Beebe, Alan O'Donohoe, who's a Python person, Kelvin, Pete Gallagher, and John Skeet so far, and Layla as well was there this week. So if you fancy kind of like hacking out some code, we usually do it for like 2 hours. It starts at like 7 till 9. And we also have prizes for the winning team as well. So we have prizes. We used to have prizes of books by packet, but now we've got £25 delivery vouchers. And I think we're extending that to be something else soon as well. So if you kind of have a free night when it's on, I'd kind of openly invite you to kind of come join it, to be fair. It's good fun.
Great stuff. So I'll put them social links in the chat as well if any of you are interested. And I'll just finish off with just letting everyone, just reminding everyone that this will be recorded. So just try and keep everything clean. If you don't want to share your name or anything like that, obviously you can keep yourself anonymous and turn off your camera if you want. But just to be aware that we will be recording this for our YouTube channel. So we'll try and keep everything clean. Thank you. I'll pass you over to Kevin. Thanks, Kevin.
Cool. Just so I can't share. Oh, I can. Cool. Let me just rearrange my windows so I've got a chat on here and things are in the right place. For 2 seconds. Just scatters everything everywhere for me, which is not very useful. So the talk tonight, I kind of came along to kind of give is everything you need to know about .NET configuration. Hopefully you'll learn something. So thanks for inviting me along. It's much appreciated. It's always good to talk at other user groups. I actually run 2 user groups myself, if people don't know me. So I run one in York, which is .NET York, adventurous titles, and .NET Chef. I've been running .NET York for probably 3 years and .NET Chef for probably about 7, 8 years now or something. I've recently joined a company called Exodus this week, so I'm pretty tired and probably shouldn't have scheduled it for the same week I actually joined another company, but there I am. And also I kind of lost my demos because it was on my old work laptop. So today I've been kind of like quickly after work, just kind of throwing some stuff together so I can have some demos to show. So hopefully they won't fail so much. But if anybody fancies kind of getting in contact with me, Twitter is probably the best place to kind of just tweet me, just throw some abuse there or something. Would be great. So going to try to cover like the basics. So from the ground up, we're going to talk about kind of how the configuration stuff is built. We're going to go through some providers of kind of what you can pull configuration from. We're also going to talk about the defaults within ASP.NET Core and how you can use binding and IOptions. And then we can also talk about how it plugs into the dependence injection inside .NET now, and also the validation stuff around IOptions as well. So the basics. The things what we're not going to talk about. So we're not going to be talking about the system.configuration, and this is the old .NET framework stuff. That's kind of old and hopefully dying and dead, but I'm sure lots of people are still working with it. We're also not going to talk about the system.configuration manager, which is the NuGet package, which you can run on .NET, any .NET standard enabled kind of framework to run the normal web config and app config configuration settings. So if you are upgrading an app from .NET Framework to .NET 5, you can actually use this package to kind of upgrade your current configuration without any changes, to be fair, and you just pull in a NuGet package. There's also two other things we're going to talk about, and that's the configuration manager, which is part of 2.0 and 2. Oh, these are the actual objects we talk to. So the configuration manager, which is the kind of newer old framework stuff, which is 2.0 or higher and .NET Standard, or the configuration settings, which is the really, really, really old one when .NET first came out and it pretty much got binned straight away. So that's this kind of stuff. So people might remember all this lovely app config. But what we are going to talk about is the new stuff, which is built on the Microsoft Extensions configuration abstractions. And this allows anybody to actually build any of their configuration providers through these abstractions. So Microsoft give you a bunch of abstractions, and they've done the same thing for a lot of other frameworks like logging, caching, dependency injection, localization. And you can implement these abstractions, which are a bunch of interfaces, and it enables any application just to take a reference to abstractions and use your implementation and swap them out for other people's implementations. And the one we're going to be using is the configuration one. And Microsoft implements that. So all the Microsoft ones are Microsoft.extensions.configuration. But there is some other ones out there. So other people, Company X could create their own configurations. And also I could create my own and publish it on NuGet as well. And people could consume them as well. And it can also run anywhere. So because it's all built on .NET Standard, even though the kind of version is a bit weird because Microsoft like marketing versions instead of actually semantic versioning. So at the moment we're on Microsoft Extension Configuration version 5, even though I don't think much of it's changed since like version 2. It all just runs points at .NET Standard. So you can run it across the .NET Framework, .NET Core, Mono, Xamarin or Maui, and all the rest of the kind of things, anything what kind of runs .NET Standard, which is great. So yeah, so it kind of implements the normal abstractions. You install it via NuGet. It has a concept of configuration providers, and we'll go into that further down the line. By default, it includes an in-memory one, which is kind of great for testing. And we can also get callbacks and reloads from the actual framework as well. And this is to enable us to kind of have configuration change at runtime and not have to restart our app. So if you've ever used the old style of configuration, you have to restart the app pool pretty much all the time if you want any config changes to kind of be applied, because we're all loaded at the start of the app. But for the newer stuff, you can reload it anytime in your application. And it's built on this concept that everything's just a key value. So there's no kind of magic under the hood. Everything has a key and you map it to a value. So we've got there, for example, we've got key 1 is just set to value 1, key 2 is set to value 2. And this makes it easier down the line for our providers. And we can also represent hierarchical structures. So if we got like two sections we want to represent, like Twilio, and have our base URI and API key in it, we can actually just denote these with a colon in the middle of it. And that means it just goes down a kind of tree structure. So we can represent hierarchical data quite easy by just using a key and again and a value. So this is exactly the same concept. We have a key and then some values. So it's all just a single flat structure. All the keys are case insensitive as well. So no matter kind of how you declare your key, if it's uppercase or lowercase, they all kind of come out the same. So for example, this one, parent one, key one, is the same as declaring it as parent one, key one as uppercase, which is really useful if you're kind of trying to get into an issue where you kind of have an uppercase letter for one of them and a lowercase for another. You don't have this kind of headache of trying to understand why it's not working. So the kind of basics is you kind of create a configuration builder, and on top of that, you just call build once you've done your kind of configuration, kind of building up your configuration object. And the default one, what we said, was kind of the memory one. So we can pass in a dictionary into the memory collection and pass it into this builder. So we can pass our keys with their values, which is based in the dictionary, and then just throw it into this add in memory collection method and then call build. And then we can build up that, and then we can just get our configuration values out there by using the default accessor, which we pass in a key. So you can just do configuration, key one, and we just get it out to the string. And there's exactly the same thing for the hierarchical ones. We can just pass in them as parent one and key one. We can also just grab a section as well. So it understands kind of where the colon is and everything else, and it's a hierarchical structure. So we can just say configuration.get section, pass in parent, and then we can then drill down into that parent section of key one and key two individually, and it'll just get them values back. So if you only need to pass a given section to a one of our classes or something we're using, we can actually just pass that individual thing, and we don't have to expose the rest of the configuration to it. We also have this concept of reload notifications. So you can get a token from the configuration object. So you get get reload token, and that gives us a token back. And then we can register a callback on that token. So this is just register a callback and saying it's going to write a line to the console saying configuration changed. But then we can call reload on it, and then that outputs that line. But if you try to reload it again, it won't do anything because we have to re-register our reload token because it's been refreshed. So I'm just going to show a bit of a demo. So I'm using Rider because I love Rider. I think it's great. That's one of the JetBrains products. So enter the raffle. You might win it, and you'll never need to open Visual Studio again. So this is our first demo. So we've got a bunch of values, key one, value one, parent one, key, etc. We've got our configuration builder. We're adding that bunch of a memory collection, which is a dictionary to it, and we call them build. And that just means we can do get some values out of there by just doing configuration, and we can just pass in key one, for example. Actually, let's just do that time again. I'm going to open this terminal instead, so I can zoom in. 1 second. Try to get over that thing in a minute. So instead of it coming up in the little tiny box down the corner in Rider, you can all see it now. Yeah, so just ignore the warnings. It's because I've got methods but aren't declared, aren't being used. So that just outputs our value, what we just said before. So we got a value one there. And then we can just do the same thing for getting our section out. And then we can go to that section instead, and then pull out key one, for example. And that'll just pull out them two values what we just declared. But we can also use the reload tokens as well. So this is this down here. So this is getting the reload token from the configuration. It's registering this callback here, which is just going to write a line and say reload. So that'll reload it twice, but we'll only get one callback. So that's in case you want to kind of refresh the whole application of your configuration changes and update your application maybe, or do whatever you like. You have the ability as well. So that's that example. So let's flip back to the slides. So I'm just going to talk about configuration providers. So the actual Microsoft implementation actually has a bunch of these already built in, and they're all in separate NuGet packages. So one we've already talked about is the memory one. And that's kind of like the base one, what everything's like is provided by default in the kind of default NuGet package. There's also one called file configuration. So there's JSON, XML, and any ones. And they're all in separate NuGet packages. You can use environment variables as well, which is quite common. So if you're using like things like Docker, it's really common now to use environment variables for your configuration. We can use user secrets as well. So this is a store for your development needs. Also, we can use things like command line configuration provider. So if you're passing command line arguments into it, you can do that. There's also a bunch for Azure. So if you use Azure App Configurator configuration, you can use that. And also for Key Vault, if you've got any secrets we want to store as well for like maybe your API keys. And there's lots of other community providers ones as well. So AWS provide a couple as well for their KMS, and also they also have a configuration kind of app configuration kind of provider as well. So we've already talked about the memory one. This is the memory one. It's pretty simple. The file provider one, yeah. So we got them 3 different types, which is kind of what Microsoft provide for us. There's other ones which are like the YAML ones, but they're provided by external parties. And they're all separated into separate NuGet packages, so you don't have to just reference everything to kind of get one single provider. And this is kind of how you add them to your configuration builder. So very similar to before, you just keep chaining things together. So we call either add any file, add JSON file, or add XML file. We pass in the kind of the name for the actual file name, where you want to pull it from. We can actually tell it if it's optional or not. So if you set it as optional as true, if it's not there, it'll just continue and just ignore that file didn't exist. If it isn't optional, then I'll throw an exception once you call build, which is useful if you kind of need that file to be there all the time and somebody's not copying that file there. You probably want your application to blow up at the startup, not to kind of just use no configuration. And there's this extra parameter on here, which is reload on changes. So this is kind of what we're talking about to start off with. If there's any kind of changes in these files, we can tell the configuration object to kind of reload itself on any kind of file changes. So that anyone kind of maps these kind of keys into these kind of style flat objects really. So we've got like a key, which is any file that goes obviously straight to any file. And then we've got a section, which is logging : log level. And then we've got inside there default and Microsoft. And then these come out as log level, just a hierarchical kind of key of logging, log level, default, etc. So just so that you probably really expect it to do. And what it does is just flatten the structure. The JSON one is very similar. So every single object in the JSON object structure just gets flattened down. So every single nested object just gets splattered out. So you just end up with multiple kind of lines for a single thing. So this one is the same thing. XML is the thing, exactly the same. So just a lot more verbose because it's XML, but there's similar concept to apply. So everything just ends up with these individual keys, which are just flat. The environment variables configuration provider is a bit different. And so because the colon is not supporting things like Linux, we use a double underscore instead to denote a colon. So when you're declaring them, it has to be a double underscore for the hierarchical structure ones. These are case insensitive. So this is so that like the standard environment conventions can actually be kind of adhered to. So in Linux, lots of people use everything as uppercase in Bash. So that you can just keep declaring everything as uppercase environment variables, and the configuration provider won't really care about it because it's all kind of case insensitive. We can also, with the environment variable ones, you can give a prefix. So if you have like a load of environment variables in your machine, you probably don't want to load everything. So you can say only load the ones with the prefix of product A. So maybe you have like our application and we just kind of denote that all these environment variables are for this certain product. So that means if we export this environment variable of like Twilio _ API key, we'll just get a key of Twilio : API key. And the same thing is if you do it in PowerShell as well, you just get the same kind of structure. So in PowerShell, obviously, because it's on Windows, you can just use a colon or you can use the double underscore. The user secrets is a bit of a kind of weird one, I'd say. So there's a unique kind of GUID within inside the CS proj, and that points to like a user secrets folder within inside of your app data on your user account. And for Windows, it's in app data, and then it's in Microsoft Secrets user ID, which is the one that's in the project file. And on Mac and Linux, it's in your root to your user directory in a hidden folder called Microsoft and user secrets. And these are just JSON files, and it's actually built on top of the normal JSON provider. And that's kind of, all it does is kind of link it up to a certain ID in a folder instead. And these secrets are not encrypted at all. They're kind of set, you shouldn't really store sensitive data anyway, locally. So if you've got some kind of, I don't know, your company's secrets, you should not store them kind of like locally. But these are the things where maybe like multiple members on the team need to store their own unique keys for maybe they're using their own RabbitMQ cluster or Azure Service Bus cluster for kind of talking to that. And they all have their own personal ones. Then they can store their own personal one for the configuration in the user secrets. And you set up exactly pretty much the same thing, except you pass in a type instead. So you call add user secrets. You pass in the assembly what you want to kind of grab the secrets from. So that's how it gets the GUID. And you can also say if it's optional and if you wanted to reload on change as well. There's also a generic kind of overload as well, where you can just pass in a type which is in that assembly, and it'll go grab that assembly for that type. And if you want to put things into the user secrets, so to kind of create the section inside the CS proj, you call user secret init, and that will actually create that. If you want to set a value, you call user secret set, and then the value and the key. You can also list all the secrets, and then you can also remove the secrets as well by calling the remove, and there's also a clear one to clear everything down as well. One of the configuration providers is actually the configuration provider from configuration, and that's called chain configuration provider. And this is really good if you've got like multiple configurations where you've got and you want to join them all together. So actually ASP.NET Core does this when it starts up. It actually creates its own configuration provider and then injects the configuration into your own configuration provider for your application. So it piggybacks on itself. So you can pass in any amount of kind of configuration objects and just join them all together. So this is just using the aggregate function inside link to go create a new configuration builder and just keep calling add configuration with the next one, and then just keeps returning it, so it joins them all together. Also, one thing to note is that order matters. So the last one to actually be declared within inside the configuration builder will be the first one that gets evaluated, and it'll go up the chain. So for example, if we call adding memory collection 3 times with the same item key declared 3 times with different values, so we've got 1, 2, and 3. If we evaluate that, it will only get 3 outputted, and that's because this one was the first one that got evaluated. If this didn't exist in this one, it'll go up to the next one. And if it didn't exist in that one, it'll go up to the next one as well. So you can use things like, you can have some base configuration for your development stuff, and then you might kind of plumb environment variables on top of that, which just override your current configuration. So this is a cool thing what I kind of found out as well within the configuration stuff. And it's not, I don't think it's actually on the Microsoft site. you can actually get a view of kind of where the actual the data came from. So on a configuration object, you can call this get debug view, which will give you a bunch of string lines, will tell you all the kind of keys and the values and where they've come from. So for this example, I've got like an event and a value what's DDD, and it says that's come from an in-memory configuration provider. I've got a key was any file, and it says it's come from the any configuration provider, and it even tells you the actual file name, what it's actually come from as well. And the same thing for the rest of them. So that's really useful if you're trying to figure out why your configuration's actually, you're like, oh, why is this not loading my configuration properly? You can just pretty much just call this in your setup code, and then you can diagnose it pretty easily, which is quite nice. So let's just go have a look at that. So demo 2. So this has got a add-in JSON file, which is called Abstractions.json. We've got optionals false. We've got to tell it to reload as well. And I'm just iterating over it and just writing the key out each time. So if we run this, yeah, I have to keep pressing the key. So if I press a key, it'll load them values, and these values are getting pulled from this app settings here. So this is getting pulled from key 1 and section 1, key 2, both these values here and here. So if we actually change these, I think it should reload them as well, yeah. So because we've got that reload flag set to true, every time we change our configuration and it goes reevaluates it, it'll get the new values. So now we've got hello world in here. If we turn that to false, so if we quit out that, and we turn that to false, and run it again. Just look at the hello world every single time. But now if we go and change this to something else, we'll still get hello world because it doesn't reload the changes every time kind of the settings change. So depending on what scenario you're in, you might want that. So you can just automatically reload configuration files while the app is running. So let's just get rid of that one for the time being. Oh, so also if we change this as well to show an example of that. So if we change that to say it's app settings -1, and we tell it, say it's optional as false, yeah, that's a good idea. And then run that again, you'll see it just blows up as well, which is also great. So that'll just blow up saying can't find configuration file, app settings -1 JSON was not found, and it's not optional. So it's quite explicit in kind of what it's doing, and quite easy for you to diagnose if the app starts up and your configuration file is not there. So let's just look at the user secrets. So with the user secrets, the JSON, the app settings has this property inside of it, CS prod, shall we? And it's just an ID with a GUID. And that's the thing that relates back to your local settings, where it loads from a file. So if we go do that, show me the true. So if we do .NET user, so it says we've got no user secrets at the moment. So if we go set 1, so we can put my fancy key 1 and have it just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can list that, it'll go list it again. So that means we can go get this value by just changing this to say, go get me the my fancy key 1. And then now if we run it, you'll go load that out of the user secrets instead. But that means if we're sharing like a code base with multiple developers, each developer can have their own user secrets, which point to whatever they like. So they might have different keys for things and stuff like that. I have to press a letter. So that'll load it out of the app secrets. That's pretty much it. Environment variables is like a simple one. So I'm just going to so if we just set that at the top to set the environment variable in the actual process, we should be able to just get that straight out of here as if it was passed in. So if we do that instead, I could actually set it in the console as well. But so yeah, so that pulled that through. Actually, maybe, yeah, I'll just prove it actually works from the console as well. So if I just get rid of this, there. If we run it, that should pull it through. There we go. So we can set our environment variables with our current session, and then I'll just load them through as well, just like magic. So back to the slides. So most people are probably working on ASP.NET Core apps. So these are either web APIs, Razor pages, Blazor, and I don't know what else you can run it, SignalR. And these have a kind of default when you set them up. So when you kind of get the boilerplate template out, it creates you this program CS file, which creates this default builder here, this create default builder. And this does a lot of magic under the hood. So it wires a ton of stuff together, which you don't see. And before in 3.1, they changed it so you just called this and it created a default loader configuration for you. In 2.1, it was actually all declared in here. So they kind of streamlined it a bit. And this is the kind of default configuration, or it kind of sets up for you. And you can extend it, but this is kind of the default. So it actually adds a default I configuration. So it already has a configuration object, what is kind of used for itself when it started up. And it adds that into your own configuration. This has things like the ASP.NET Core environment, which you use later down the line, and also the .NET environment as well. And then it also adds a app settings.json. And then on top of that, it adds an app settings and then the environment.json. And the environment property here comes out of either the ASP.NET Core environment variable or the .NET environment variable as well. And then on top of that, we had user secrets, but that's only added if it's in development mode as well. And then on top of that, we have environment variables. So by default, environment variables will take precedence over anything else up the stream. So if you declare like a bunch of app settings in your app settings.json, the environment variables will override them if you've got them declared. So the next section is on options and bindings. And this is kind of a way we can take them kind of fundamental building blocks and create them into a nicely typed object. Because we're writing in C#, we obviously want to kind of work with typed objects. So we get our configuration data, which we've declared, which is all just flat keys, and transpose that into like an object like this. So we can expect to be able to bind strings, ints, longs, GUIDs, date times, and time spans. And we can also have objects as well. So we can have complex object types. So the actual binding stuff is actually built on top of the Microsoft Extensions configuration abstractions, which I said, which is this is the Microsoft implementation of it. So if somebody else has actually built a bunch of configuration libraries on top of these abstractions, the binding libraries will actually just work with their configuration stuff that they've built. So it's not just tied to the Microsoft one. So the binding stuff comes from this namespace in this package on Microsoft extensions.configuration.binding. And that also means that we can also, build our own kind of extension configuration stuff on top of it, and the binding all still work. So this is kind of the default recommendation way of actually accessing the configuration, and it's all strongly typed classes or records. And it kind of adheres to kind of decent software engineering principles, such as interface segregation and separation of concerns. But so we can take a load of kind of configuration values and just put them into separate kind of classes, which we then pass on to objects which only care about them certain properties. But there's actually some kind of extra methods what we get from using binding. So we can actually call getValue instead of a normal default accessor, which gets us a string. So we can say configuration.getValue, pass in a generic type and the key, and it'll go bind it into that object type. We can also bind that straight into an object by just newing up the object and then calling bind on it, and that will kind of bind them two together. But we have to new up the object in this instance. Another example is we can actually bind to a section. So these are kind of the hierarchical ones of example, and then you've got a value of int and GUID inside that. So we can just say for this section of example, just bind to them options as well. So, but this is also creating that object beforehand as well. And then we can also just get the section and call get as well and pass in the options. And this will new the object up for us inside of itself, which might be useful depending on what you're doing. And kind of this extends on to kind of, that was just like kind of the default binding kind of ways to do it, which not many people really use because it's kind of very fundamental of kind of how it's doing on the hood. A lot of people normally use the dependence injection way. So for this, we can easily configure options classes what we created by just calling configure and then passing the options what we want to configure and then the configuration object. Or we can also pass in the configuration section as well. So this registers, so you can also, so that's the way in ASP.NET Core, sorry. And this is if you're handcrafting your own IOC container, we can just pass in the configuration to it as well. So this just declaring the service container ourselves. But this one actually requires an extra NuGet package, which is this one here, configuration extensions, which kind of just adds extra stuff onto the service collection. So there's loads of stuff that actually registers it under hood when you actually call that method. So we get an IOption factory of your options, which is registered into transient dependency. And it registers a bunch of default things underneath that to kind of configure options. So we have an I configuration of options, and the default one doesn't use up your type of class. But if you want to kind of have some defaults inside of that, you can pass in some defaults. You can also configure named options as well, and that's a different implementation of it. And you can also do post configuration options as well. So if you want to kind of reconfigure your options after it's been configured, maybe you're using a library and they use configuration options to configure their library, and you don't have access to kind of, you want to kind of template some things out, you can use post configuration options to call your own kind of code to rework the configuration after it's been all configured. But the kind of normal default ones, what you're probably always going to be using are IOptions of TOptions and IOptions of Snapshot and IOptions of Monitor. There's also a one for monitoring the cache as well. So the IOptions, the default one, which most people use, is registered as a singleton. It reads the configuration at startup, and it starts this fixed configuration all the way through your app until it dies and restarts. And it also supports named options as well. So if you've got the same type of options, but you want to call them different things because maybe you've got an API where you call it the same API, but you call it different with different keys or something, you can, and you use the same options, you can name them instead. There's also an IOptions snapshot. And this is registered at this as a scoped lifetime. So in like ASP.NET Core, every time you call your API, you get a new scope on your IOC container. And that means you'll get another options class created every single time. And that reads the configuration at that point. So the whole request of your, maybe your HTTP request is always going to be in the same state for the options, but the next request in might change configuration. So you have the ability to either have your app all the time just running the same, or you have an option to kind of every time somebody does a call, they have a consistent state, but the configuration might change between calls. So they both kind of pretty much look the same. They have the same interface to them. IOptions has a TOptions value, so the generic. And actually the IOptions snapshot actually implements an IOptions as well. So you can substitute them if you really want to. And to get the kind of options, your options out of it, you just call the .value property of it, which is this thing. And then you can just read the values when you want. The IOption monitor is how you can register for callback changes. So if somebody is editing the JSON file, which your configuration is loaded from, it'll give you kind of instant notifications that that configuration changed, and you can do something about it. So if you've got some, I don't know, some kind of thick client and you're reading configuration changes, you might pop up a message to the user saying, oh, some kind of configuration change has changed. You might want to log out and log back in again to get the new changes to your app. And that is all done by this options monitor. So it's similar to the other kind of change tracking stuff. We just pass in a callback. This is actually supposed to have an arrow here, actually. Don't worry, it's not going on. So this is just a callback, a non-like callback. It'll just write the event name. And it can also get the current value out of this one as well. So I'll just have a quick demo of that to show that off. So I'm not going to write any code in this one, but it's fairly, I'll just walk you through the code. So we create a service collection. So that's our IOC container. We've configured a app settings JSON file to be loaded, and we have reloads on. We configure an example options. And this is what our example option looks like. It's got a property called int and a property called GUID, which is an int and a GUID. And then we add a transient dependency of demo 3 app, and I'll go into that in a second. We create the service provider from the container, and then we just loop around in a circle forever. We create a scope every single time we loop around, and then we get the demo app, what we've created, which will be for that scope. And then we call an execute method on it, and then we just wait and then do the same thing again and again. So this is kind of simulating as if you're calling like a HTTP request on your web server or any kind of other kind of scoped request. And if you go into here, this has got a dependency of IOptions of example options, and it's just setting that property to this read-only member. We're getting the value out of it, and then we're just displaying the int every single time. And this is loading from the same app settings as what we was in the previous example. So if we run that one, we should get some values out of it. So it's coming back as 909. So if you change to 1, this will just continue doing 909 forever. And that's because we've got a IOptions injected into here. So if you stop that, and then we inject in the IOptions snapshot instead, and this actually can be set to a IOptions. We can run that. Now it's displaying 1, but if you go to our app settings and type in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and go back to application, it'll automatically reload it because it's on a different scope. So they'll get evaluated on every single time that a dependency tree is evaluated. So that just works like that, which might be useful for certain applications. The other one is, And that's, I think that was that demo. All of that demo. So on to validation now. So there's ways to validate our configuration options as well. So if we have like a range of numbers where we have to supply, so we might say these options can only be set at values 1, 2, and 3. And if somebody tries to start the application up and they're not 1, 2, and 3, we should probably blow up because we don't want like our application to be trying to use configuration options which aren't available for kind of our application. So the validation stuff by default raises an options validation exception when it tries to go fetch the options. So this is not when you build it, it's actually when you call .value on the options class, you'll throw an exception. So your application could be running at this time. And the reason why it does this is because configuration changes can happen throughout your application. So your application could be running an hour, somebody chose some changes to the configuration. And at that point, the configuration options might be invalid, but they might have been valid when they started you might have started the application. And there's three main ways you can actually do the validation. You can use normal data annotation attributes, and you can use inline validation callbacks, and you can implement your own classes as well. So this is the kind of way you do the data annotations. So when you declare this on the container, you actually now call add options instead of configure options, which is a bit different, but it works exactly the same way. So you pass in the type here, and then you call bind, and then say validate data annotations. And these are just the normal data annotations where you'd use for kind of doing the normal ASP.NET Core validations, or if you use an empty framework, you can use them there as well. So this one's using a regex on a name property, and this one's using a range on an age property. And you can also give different error messages as well, which I'll come back. So then the next one is just using a delegate. So we just pass in like a method which returns a Boolean for what being validated. So if you want something really simple, this is probably the easiest way to go. So it passes you back the actual options itself, and then you can just check the property. So we were saying that the age is over 18, that's valid. And then the other way is to use a IOptions validate options of T. So this is where we kind of can pass in a bunch of these, and it'll evaluate each one of them. So I've created my own class which implements the validate options of my option type. It passes you across the name of the options as well as the options itself. So maybe for certain options, which are named options, you might not want to validate them in the same way. I don't know why, but it has that ability. And then inside of here, you can do the same thing. So it's pretty much the same as the any other kind of validation kind of stuff. You do the validation code and you either return a success or a failed, and the failed accepts like the reason why it failed as well. And the usage is kind of how I said before. When you call .value on it, that throws the exception here, and then it'll get caught, and then you can output all the failures. So there might be one or more failures of why the configuration couldn't be loaded at that time. But this could happily run continuously, and it could blow up like a couple of hours down the line when somebody does some configuration changes. I do have a demo of that actually. Quickly finish this off when I finish work. So this is that example. So this is just using it in memory collection. So we've got a name and an age to the configuration. I'm adding options of validation options here, which has these data annotations of a regular expression and a range on name and age. We're binding that to the configuration. And then we're just doing the same thing as the one above it, except we're not in a loop. So we're creating all the container stuff, creating a scope, creating this app, and then just calling execute on it. And then this execute method just does what it says on that slide. It goes and tries to get the configuration options and then writes it out to the console. And if there's any exceptions, it writes the errors out to the console instead. So this has not got any kind of validation on it at the moment, and it's set the age to 4. So if I just run this one, it should just output hello Kevin, and then it says I'm 4 years old, which is quite funny. So if you want to enable the data annotations, which is in the range of 18 to 100 age, we can just add this method onto it, which is the validate data annotations. And then if you just run that again, it just throws that exception and doesn't write out our value, saying the value must be, for age must be between 18 and 100, which is nice and simple. And then we can also do the callback one as well, which is just checking the age is greater than 18. If we run that, it should give us the validation exception as well. And because we're not give it any kind of reason, it just says a validation error has occurred and doesn't give us any kind of output. So that's kind of like a good way to kind of validate your options when you kind of your application, if you've got different kind of criteria for kind of your options. So in summary, we went through some basics of like configuration, the new configuration stuff in .NET. So now you understand that it can run pretty much anywhere. We also should know that there's a lot of kind of providers for it, and there's actually, you can build your own providers on top of it as well. And there's a lot of community providers. Most of the time, you're probably going to be using the ASP.NET Core like defaults for kind of how the providers are set up, which are pretty useful kind of how they've set them up. And they're kind of geared towards more modern software development. So people using environment variables instead of using like configuration files. We talked about the bindings and how IOptions works and how it all relates to dependence injection, and also how we can validate our options as well. So that's pretty much it for the talk. There's lots of documentation actually on the Microsoft website, which is really useful. So there's stuff about how configuration works in .NET on there, and also the options pattern as well. And the option pattern is actually used elsewhere more than the configuration as well. So it's quite useful to kind of have an understanding of that. You can actually use the options pattern without the configuration as well. So you can just create a bunch of options in your setup code, which then you can just plumb in to downstream in your application. But that's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions?
Kevin, before we go into the questions,
yeah,
we're just going to stop the recording. So
okay.
for the recording purposes, I just want to, thank you. And if you can like and subscribe for any of our upcoming videos. So thank you very much.